Right, good morning. Welcome. And I'm glad that people are here because I thought perhaps with a long weekend, people might be away and then we wouldn't have anybody at the shir. So I'm pleased to see that you're with us. It's great to have the opportunity to learn something when it's a quieter time. And what we're going to learn about is about what we're doing. We're going to learn about the value of learning, and specifically the value of learning together in a group. Now, we did touch on this already previously in an earlier Mishnah, and so you're going to see that this is a theme that we're sort of familiar with because we have touched on it before, and we're going to have to understand why it is that this particular Mishnah we're going to learn today is presented in the fashion in which it is presented. However, before we start, I have to obviously mention the fact that it's a special day today, Pesach Sheni, and the theme of Pesach Sheni is the theme of what happens in life if there's an opportunity to do something for Hashem, and somehow we miss that opportunity. Then what? How much chance for catch-up do you get? So the original story of Pesach Sheni is a story of people who could not participate in the original Pesach because of circumstances that were outside of their control. The story was that they were involved in something which was very important, different views of exactly what it was that they were doing, but the bottom line is that it ended up being impure, and in order to bring the Pesach sacrifice on Pesach, you have to be in a state of purity, and they were not. So what happened was they came and they complained to Moshe, and they said, it's not fair, and we should have the opportunity, and why can we not bring the Pesach sacrifice? And then they were given this new mitzvah called Pesach Sheni. But one of the things that's absolutely fascinating is the idea that afterwards, when Hashem tells Moshe to explain to the Jewish people that they have this opportunity of Pesach Sheni, it's so interesting that he dafka frames the language as if there's somebody who is tamei, somebody who's impure, so that could be no fault of your own, oy bederech rechoy kolochem, or a person who is too far from Yerushalayim and therefore they cannot bring the Pesach sacrifice, lochem. Lachem, the Gemara understands to mean that it was their choice. They chose not to get their act together. They were negligent. They were reckless. They were disinterested, and they didn't get to bring the Pesach sacrifice. That's who Hashem offers a second chance to. That's what Pesach Sheni tells us. And I think it's really important to bear that in mind, that very often we expect that the Torah will excuse us if we make a mistake. But what's important about Pesach Sheni is that the Torah wants to facilitate an opportunity for us when we haven't made a mistake, when we've done something of our own choice that was inappropriate, that was wrong. Still, the Torah wants to find a way to assist us to be able to make good on it. So I think that's a nice segue into what we're going to talk about in today's Mishnah, because today's Mishnah tells us the value of learning Torah in a group. When you learn it, when you come across information that we're going to discover today, so you're going to think, well, I missed all of those opportunities. There's so many times that I perhaps sat alone reading a book and didn't realize that there's an extra value in participating in a shir, and particularly a shir with a group of people that's over 10, as we're going to discover. So I've lost all of those opportunities. And a person could very quickly fall into some element of despair. I had an interesting conversation last night with somebody, and it emerged from the conversation, just the way that this person was speaking, I thought it was quite representative of how many Jewish people see themselves. We can be super critical of ourselves. And when we let ourselves down and we don't do what we should have, and when we discover that there was a particular way to behave and we were not living up to that standard, that's when we start to beat ourselves up and we say, I should have done better and I should have known better, and so on and so forth. So it's quite valuable to understand this principle. It's built into life. It is an expectation that Hashem has that we get things wrong. Now what are we going to do about it? Rather than to fret over what went wrong, the most important thing is to say, so how could I do things differently? Now, of course, if you're sitting together with us right now, learning together, you're already doing it. You're learning together in a group. So whatever the value is of learning in a group, we are, thank God, in a position to be able to access that value right here, right now. If you feel that you should have done it more in the past, okay, so from here on forward, we have the opportunity to fix it. So we're going to have a look at a few different stages of Torah learning, each of which will express a different kind of connection that could be achieved. So let's have a look at the Mishnah, and once we've got the text, then we can take it apart into its components. Okay, I see the first letter got cut off somehow. It's Rabbi Chalafta ben Doisa, Ish Kfar Chananya Oimer. Rabbi Chalafta ben Doisa, who came from a place called Kfar Chananya. He was a student of the very famous Rabbi Meir. And he taught the following. So he's effectively going to give us 5 categories. Asara sheyoshvim v'oiskim b'Torah. If 10 people sit together and they engage in Torah. You'll notice the word over here is a very interesting use. He doesn't say 10 people who sit v'loimdim Torah and they study Torah. He uses the word oiskin b'Torah, which implies more than just study. They're invested, they're exploring, they're researching. So the implication over here is people who are working through a concept together rather than just sitting and having some kind of a social gathering on a topic of casual conversation related to Torah. So when you have 10 people who band together and they really invest in learning Torah, what happens? Shechina shruya beinehem. The divine the divine presence, shruya beinehem, it rests amongst them. Now, in each case, he's going to give us these different perspectives. In each case, he's going to validate what he says based on a pasuk, a verse in the Torah. So in this particular case, it's a verse that says, Elokim nitzav ba'adas kel, that God stands together with adas kel. And adas, that's when you say something as a conjunction, then you put the tof at the end. So if it was just the noun standing on its own, the word would be Eidah. So the Eidah, the congregation of Hashem. Hashem stands in the congregation of Hashem. Okay, so that immediately implies to us, obviously, that Hashem is in a particular environment, in particular presence. That's where Hashem stands. Where is this place? Adas kel, in the congregation of Hashem. So the first thing, obviously, that we have to know is in each case, we're going to have to understand how do we know that the words of that particular pasuk prove the point that Rabbi Chalafta wants to say. Because, of course, it's great to make an argument, and even if you fish out a verse from the Torah and say, you see, that proves my point, you have to do better than that. It has to be a clear link between what you're trying to say and what the pasuk is saying. So we need to ask ourselves the question over here, what is the clear link between what Rabbi Chalafta wants to say and what this particular pasuk says about Hashem standing in the community or the congregation of God? So it's interesting that we discover the word Eidah as a specific number of people in a very unfortunate story. It's strange, because you would have expected that if I want to show that the Torah attributes Eidah, community, to a group of 10, because that's what we're about to say, right? We're talking about if 10 people learn together, that's when the divine presence is there. So if you wanted to find a place in the Torah that would speak about community or congregation, you would expect that it would be in a very positive context, and it's not. So where's the story? Fast forward a few parashas from where we are currently, and you get to the parasha of the spies, the Meraglim, the spies who went to explore the land of Israel, of Canaan, and they were supposed to come back and they were supposed to tell everybody how we're going to do this, how we're going to fulfill Hashem's promise to capture and conquer the promised land. But they don't. It's a debacle of note, and out of 12 spies, 10 of them say it's impossible. We'll never conquer the land. And the Gemara even goes so far as to suggest that they believed even Hashem himself could not conquer the land. So at that point, Moshe Rabbeinu turns around and he says, how much longer will I have to tolerate ha'eda hara'a hazois? This bad Eidah. That's the word we're looking for over here. Eidah, which means a community or a congregation. How many people was he referring to? 10. 10 people, that's what he was referring to. 10 spies out of the 12 who persisted with this negative message about Israel. So from there we learn that Eidah means 10. Interesting, right? You would have expected it to come from such a nice, healthy, happy place. And where do we find the word? Unfortunately, in a pretty disastrous environment, a pretty negative environment. That's why Rabbi Chalafta brings this pasuk, which says, Adas Kel. There is a congregation of 10 people that could be for negative, and then there's Adas Kel. There's a congregation of people who come together to do something which is holy and positive. When you have that kind of a congregation, when 10 people get together in order to produce something which is positive and holy, then Hashem is standing there with them. Okay. So I'm going to go through the entire Mishnah, and then we'll come back to this and explore just a little bit further. From where do we know that even if 5 people learn together, the divine presence will be with them too? So clearly you can pick up what the theme of the Mishnah is, right? The theme of the Mishnah is that there is value in people studying Torah together in a group rather than individuals. That's what we started. We say 10 people is the ultimate. 10 people is where the Shekhinah is there for sure. And then he says, afilu, even. Even is a word of compromise. Okay, even if we don't get 10 out of 10, at least we'll have 5 out of 10. And that's going to be the flow of the Mishnah. So the consistent message that keeps repeating through this Mishnah is that the ideal way to learn Torah is 10 plus people. 10 and up is the ideal way to learn Torah. If you can't do that, at the very least, do 5. How do you know 5? Shenemar, because there's a pasuk, there's a verse that says, Va'agudosoi al eretz yisada, that Hashem has established his agudah over the earth. Now, what is an agudah? For our conversation at this point, we're going to explore it further shortly, but for our conversation at this point, an agudah is effectively anything that comes together in some kind of a bundle. So agudah is somehow related to the number 5. How? How do you see that agudah necessarily relates to the number 5? So if you take your 5 fingers of your hand and you clench them all into a fist, that is also called an agudah. Sometimes it's called egroif, which is the actual word for a fist, but the bunching up, the bringing together of your fingers is called an agudah. So from that we learn that the word agudah means 5. And therefore the implication over here is that even if it's just 5 people who get together to learn Torah, the Shekhinah, divine presence, is there too. Now, at this point, and consistently through the rest of the Mishnah, you will probably have a nagging question in your mind. In fact, a double nagging question. Number 1 is, if I'm going to be able to prove that the divine presence is with us, as long as there are 5 people there, why did I have to first prove that the divine presence is there for 10? Surely that's logical. If 5 people can pull it off, definitely 10 people could pull it off. And as we go down the line and we say 3 people, 2 people, 1 person, that question is just going to keep getting stronger. So if I already know that the divine presence is there when 1 person studies Torah, which will be the conclusion of this Mishnah, why did I have to break it down into all these components? That's the first question that's going to just niggle in my mind. Just logically, why did you have to tell me? Right? Why did you have to tell me each stage? I could work it out logically. The other question is, just let's understand, so what's the big deal then of having 10 people if 1 person on their own, as we'll see at the end of the Mishnah, can have the divine presence, even at this point? If 5 people are good enough, why did you begin by saying 10 people? So those are the 2 nagging questions that are going to accompany us right through the Mishnah. But for now, let's continue with the Mishnah. From where in the Torah do I know that even if it's just 3 people who study Torah together, then the divine presence will be with them? What's unique about, where do I see? Where do I see in the Torah that 3 people is enough to garner the divine presence? Shenemar, so that we prove from a pasuk that says, Pirkei Elokim yishpoit, that Hashem will judge amongst Elokim. Now that's a tricky one, because Elokim is the name of God, and that's what you expect. You expect that if we're going to even go back 2 lines, when we spoke about 10 people and the divine presence, the word that we used for the divine presence was the word Elokim. Now we're talking about Hashem being together with Elokim. How does that work? Isn't Elokim God himself? So is this some kind of a split personality? God is going to be together with God. We do know that every name of Hashem is very specifically chosen to convey a particular aspect of Hashem's interaction with the world. So the name that represents Hashem as beyond creation and therefore the source of creation is the name that is spelled Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. That is the name that rolls in past, present, and future into one word. That is the name that represents Hashem as supernatural. That is the word that reminds the name of Hashem that reminds us that Hashem gives life to the world. So it comes from the word mehaveh, which means to bring into existence. So not only is Hashem mechayeh, does he give life to an existing world, but mehaveh, he causes the world to come into existence at every moment. That's the name represented by Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. The name Elokim, well, we know that is the name associated with the actual process of creation. That's why Bereshis bara Elokim, the first line of the Torah, tells us in the beginning, Elokim created. Unfortunately, English is a very poor language when it comes to spirituality. So English can give you what? God and Lord, Almighty, I don't know. But in Hebrew, we've got many, many names of Hashem. And so we specifically use the name Elokim. So when people say in the beginning God created, it's actually a poor translation. It should be in the beginning Elokim created. Why Elokim? Well, one of the reasons is because Elokim is a name that represents power. And it's not limited only to describe God's power. And that's the interesting irony about it, is that it's a plural word. How can I refer to Hashem with a plural word? Hashem is one. Elokim, for those people familiar with basic Hebrew grammar, we know that Elokim is in the plural. So how can I have a plural name for Hashem? Because this is the name of power, and power is not only something that Hashem expresses. For that reason, there are places in the Tanakh where angels are referred to as Elokim. Why? Because they are a manifestation of Hashem's power in this world. So therefore they can carry the name Elokim. In this particular pasuk, Bekerev Elokim Yishpoit, the clue is in the third word. Yishpoit means to judge. So when you have, on a panel in Judaism, the basic panel of a court is 3 judges. So when you have 3 people who come together with the right values, and they judge cases according to the morality of Torah, they are called Elokim. They are, so to speak, the manifestation of divine power inside the system and structure of running a moral and just society. So Bekerev Elokim Yishpoit tells us that if there are 3 people who are together, we now know that the number 3 is a number associated with Elokim, because that is the number of the minimal bench of a Jewish court. So when you have 3 people together, then Bekerev Elokim Yishpoit, Hashem will enter into that experience, and Hashem will, so to speak, judge together with them. From here, Rabbi Chalafta learns that if you have 3 people studying Torah together, then Hashem is with them. Then he asks, how do you know if even 2 people study Torah together, what we call the classic chavrusa system? Any person who's been to a yeshiva, you'll know that that's typically how yeshiva study works, in pairs. So how do you know that even if 2 people study Torah, the divine presence will be there with them? Shenemar, so there we see a pasuk that says, Oz nidberu yirei Hashem ish el re'ehu. Then you'll have a scenario where people who are God-fearing will speak one to his peer. So that implies, what are they talking about? The fact that they're described up here as God-fearing people implies that what they're talking about is something that is respectful to God, something that Hashem would want them to speak about, aka Torah. So what happens when they speak? Then vayakshev Hashem vayishma. Then Hashem will eavesdrop, so to speak. Hashem will listen into their conversation, and he will hear what it is that they have to say. And eventually Rabbi Chalafta ben Dosa concludes, and how do we know that even one single person who sits alone, studying Torah on their own, that the divine presence is with them? Shenemar, that's based on a pasuk that says, Bechol hamokem asher azkires shmi. Hashem says, any place where you will just mention my name, avoy elecha, I will come to you in that place, uveirachticha, and I will bless you in that place. Now you may wonder at this point, what has Torah got to do with mentioning Hashem's name? When I pray, when I daven, that's when I'm mentioning Hashem's name. Baruch atah Hashem. Right, I say Hashem's name. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu. I say Hashem's name. When I learn Torah, I don't say Hashem's name necessarily. You could learn pages and pages of Torah without saying Hashem's name once. Pages and pages of the Gemara without mentioning Hashem's name. Of the Midrash, of Shulchan Aruch, all the different books of Torah. So what does it mean that any place that you call Hashem's name, Hashem will come there and he will bless you? How does that associate with Torah? So there's a fascinating insight into what Torah really is. Unfortunately, very often what people think is that Torah is this incredible wisdom of the Jewish people. We're the smartest people around, you know. It's like an insult when they call us the people of the book. Are you joking? We're the people of the books. So many books. But that's what our whole life centers around. We're intellectual people. We appreciate education. From the youngest age, our children are being challenged to learn, to know, to memorize, to question. So that's what people think. Torah is this cultural heritage of the Jewish people that we are interested in intellect. Other people think Torah is a moral code. You know, unfortunately, the reality of our world is that in today's world particularly, everybody makes up their morality as they go along. And it's incredibly dangerous. You can actually see the effects in today's world. Because people have decided for themselves what their morality is, it's completely negotiable. And then you have to work out what happens if your proposed morality interferes with my view of morality, and it becomes really, really tricky. We're fortunate people. We don't have to work this all out. We have divine morality, comes from the source. It's immutable. And that's it. That's what the Torah is. It tells you very clearly this is what you do. It doesn't matter if you live in the 2nd century or in the 21st century. It doesn't make a difference. These are the values, and they're always going to be firm. But neither of those descriptions actually helps to understand what Torah is. Torah is, and this is an expression that our sages use about the Torah, Kol ha-Torah hishmoisav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The entire Torah is manifestations of Hashem's name. In other words, just like a person will use a name as a means for somebody else to be able to identify them. How do I call somebody if I don't know their name? Hello, excuse me, you, yes, you, in the red hat, right? But if I know somebody's name, I've got a meaningful way to be able to connect with them and to be able to get their attention. Kol ha-Torah hishmoisav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The entire Torah is names of Hashem, meaning to say it's an opportunity for us to have a meaningful channel of communication and connection to Hashem. We ingest Hashem's wisdom into our minds, and as a result of that, we feel this very intimate connection to Hashem. That's why Rabbi Chalafta can bring this pasuk to say, wherever you might be, if you mention my name, in other words, if you learn Torah, so wherever you may be, Hashem says, I'm going to come to that place, engage with you, and bless you. So what you should walk away from this Mishnah feeling is that every opportunity that I have to learn Torah, I should grab that opportunity, because it's essentially an invitation to Hashem to come and bless me. Who's not going to take that opportunity? Think about it. I'm going to weigh it up. Okay, right now I have two choices. Either I could watch the ridiculous video that somebody forwarded me on WhatsApp, or I could get Hashem to come and bless me. You know, it's like a no-brainer. Surely we should work out very clearly what it is that we're meant to be doing. Secondly, we should walk out of this Mishnah understanding that the more people I engage with when I learn Torah, the better it is. Because it's very clear that although his message is that the Shekhinah is present at every one of the 5 levels, it's clear also that the experience is not the same in each of the levels. So let's go back again and read each one and see what the distinction is between if you learn with 10 people versus 5 versus 3 versus 2 versus 1. So let's go back and look at it again. When he spoke about 10 people and 10 people coming together to learn Torah, notice 2 things. First of all, that he said, sheyoshvin va'oiskin. That was the first thing. People who sit down to engage in Torah learning. Surely that's unnecessary information. Just say they were learning Torah. Why do I have to know that they were sitting down? Also notice that the verse that he quotes says, Hashem stands in the gathering of Kel, in the gathering of Hashem, in the community of Hashem. That's interesting, because you would have expected that it would say that Hashem stands in the engagement, in the learning, in the devotion, in the commitment. Yet he says over here that Hashem stands ba'adas, implying almost that the very fact that they're in one place is already an invitation to the Shekhinah. That's the value that you get of a crowd that is 10 or more. The minute there are 10 people who are learning Torah together, the minute yoshvin, the minute they sit down, as we used to do once upon a time in today's world, the minute you're in the waiting room, in the Zoom, at that moment, nitzav, Hashem is already there. Meaning to say the greatness of learning Torah together with a group is that the divine presence is already part of the experience even before you begin to learn. Your intention is to learn. We get that. That's what's going to happen. You're going to learn, but at this point, even before you start to learn, Hashem is already present with you and looking to be part of that scenario. That tells us something very powerful. That tells us that, sometimes before shir gets started, you sit around, you schmooze a little bit, you kind of socialize, which is all very healthy. And most people would imagine, okay, after we finish that and we start the learning, that's when the magic happens. But according to this, the very fact that you're sitting in that room, even if right now you're just drinking your coffee and you're catching up on yesterday's news, that already is the divine presence. Oh, by the way, that should make us quite conscious of what we talk about, right? At that point, if the divine presence is already there with us. If there's only 5 people who are learning together, then we don't have that power. We don't have that. Just the fact that they've made a pact, that they've chosen, that they've made the decision that they're going to learn, already the Shekhinah is there. Now you need to do more than just make the decision. Now you need to do more than just sit in the room. You need to be an agudah. You actually have to have started to connect, not just to be present, not just to have showed up. You have to become the agudah. That means to say, it's like the point, so to speak, where you open the book. What page are we on again? Which mission are we doing today? It's more than just this nebulous commitment. Okay, we're going to learn Torah. If you want the divine presence, it only begins once you start to get focused on the process of the learning that you're going to do. If there are only 3 people, then you've got to get to the point of yishpoit. You're starting to judge. In other words, to analyze. You've actually started to learn. Only once you begin to actually learn, then Hashem will be there with you. Now, what is common to those 3 is that in each case, it's pretty clear that the Shekhinah is with you. Ba'adaskel, together with the community. Al eretz, in the space where you are. Pirkei Avos, with the group that is learning. Whereas when it's 2 people who are learning Torah, firstly, they actually have to speak. They actually have to be sharing the words of Torah, not just doing their own analysis, which they may have done in number 3. They actually have to be talking, and even then, it doesn't say that Hashem is with them. It says Hashem is listening to them. That already tells us that it's a little bit more distant. And if it's 1 person who learns Torah, so not only do you learn Torah, not only do you say, but it has to be Azkira Shmi. There's an implication over here. It's insinuating that you learn Torah with an awareness that it's Hashem's Torah and that you're here in order to perform what Hashem wants, not just to satisfy your intellectual curiosity, or because you had a question and you want to be able to find the answer to the question, or because you're interested in history, so you wanted to know what the Torah's version of history is, but you're actually expressing Hashem's name. Then the Shekhinah comes. Now you have to work a lot harder. If there were 10 people in the room studying together, the Shekhinah would be there amongst you right from the get-go. If you're studying on your own, you actually have to have lishma. You have to be focused on studying for the correct reasons, and even then, it doesn't say that Hashem comes into the scenario, rather Hashem comes to you and gives you a bracha, also implying that there's a certain element of distance that you could have gotten further, or you could have had a deeper relationship with had it been a group. So Rabbi Chalafta is very clear about the fact that there's always the greatest advantage of learning in a group. Now, what we need to know is, what's the significance of these 5 tiers of number? And here's where it gets really interesting. Really interesting. We're going to do it in reverse. Okay? We'll start from the lowest, and we'll build ourselves up, because what's clear in this Mishnah is that 1 is the least impactful, 2 is better, 3 is better, 5 is better, 10 is even better. In simple terms, we can distinguish them as follows. 1 person clearly is just 1 person. You don't have to be a rocket scientist. 1 person is 1 person. You have your limitations. There's only so much that you could do. 2 people is more than double. There's an expression that the Gemara uses that if 2 people carry a load, they can carry more than double of what 1 person can carry. It goes without saying that from a learning perspective, the minute you learn with a partner, the kind of learning that you will have is totally different to the kind of learning that you'd have on your own. Why? Because learning with a partner is absolutely annoying. Anybody who's done it will be able to tell you, in all honesty, that it's a very uncomfortable experience. Why? Because if I sit and learn on my own, I'm a genius. I read the information, and I get what it's saying, and I marvel at the fact that I never recognized the fact that I was so brilliant. Amazing. I read this thing, and I just understand it. I must be a genius, and nobody knows about it. If I sit and I learn with a partner, I read through and I learn, and I share my genius, and the partner says, yeah, that doesn't make sense, and then tests what I've said, which forces me now to reconsider what I thought. And they also are going to then give their own perspective and their own insight. So the depth of understanding that I get from learning with a partner is more than double what I would get learning on my own. Because learning on my own is looking through life, looking at life through my lens, through my bias, and I'd be very, very stuck in my own reality. Whereas the minute there's somebody else involved, it's a whole different experience. So we understand that there's almost an exponential growth from studying alone to studying with a partner. The minute there are 3 people involved, well, considering the fact that the Torah considers 3 people enough to have a court, to be able to have judgment, that tells you not only do you have the depth of learning, and now you have somebody else who you can test your ideas with, and they can challenge you, and they can ask questions, and you can debate, and back and forth, and from that you'll come to a far deeper understanding. If there are 3 people involved, and the Torah gives that the gravitas of a court, that means you now have an opportunity to affect beyond yourself. Not only you are able to come to clarity, but you're a court. Courts can make decisions. You can actually start choosing for the community, so to speak, what the behavior should be, what the halacha should be, what the outcome should be. The fact that the Torah allows 3 people that kind of authority tells me without question that 3 people together is much more powerful than 2 people together. 5 people, there are certain unique scenarios in Torah law where a 3-man court is insufficient, and you have to have a 5-person court. For example, there's something called an Egla Rufa. The Egla Rufa is quite a horrible story. It's where John Doe is found murdered somewhere outside of a city. And according to the Torah, you've then got to measure which is the closest city to where his body was found. And then they have to do a cleansing ritual in order to show that, we have no responsibility for the fact that somebody came through our city and was left unprotected. To facilitate the process of the Egla Arufa, that cleansing ritual, you need a Beis Din with 5 members. Why? Because you're dealing with such a sensitive issue over here. You're dealing with the fact that communities did not protect their own. You're dealing with the fact that a stranger came to town and he was exposed and he was killed. This is a very serious issue. So that tells you that 5 people who are able to then help this community to cleanse itself must have greater power than even 3 people. And 10 is a minyan. Right? We don't need any major insight into that because we know that 10 is the number in Judaism that always represents, as the Gemara says, Kol davar shebikdusha ein oimrim bepachos mi asara. That anytime you have something which is really holy in Judaism, you're not allowed to say it as part of the prayers if you have fewer than 10 people, like Kaddish, like reading the Torah in public, like the Kedusha, which we say, the repetition of the Amidah, and the special Kedusha, which is a paraphrase of the praises that the angels give to Hashem. So we understand then that 10 is the most incredible group of people. Now let's understand from a numeracy point of view. That is from, the impact, the halachic frameworks that apply to 1 person, to 2, 3, 5, 10. Let's look at the actual numbers themselves, because the numbers are obviously very carefully chosen. Nothing in Torah is by accident. And so the way that this is crafted is to teach us really important concepts that each of these numbers represent. It goes without saying that there's a huge value in the number 1, because 1 is the number of unity. But the truth is, unity when there is only 1 is no achievement. So in other words, when a person, let's say you lived on a desert island, let's just say, and there was nobody who could challenge you, debate you, you could do anything in the way that you wanted. If somebody would come interview you and say, wow, you live on this desert island, how is it? And you would say, it's so peaceful. We'd say, big deal, obviously it's peaceful. There's nobody to bother you. Why wouldn't it be peaceful? So the weakness of 1 is that it's only solid because there's nobody else interfering. So exactly like when I learn on my own, the greatness of my learning is actually the weakness of my learning, because there's no interaction, because there's no sharing, because there's no speaking, because there's no learning from others. So I feel really good about myself, but the truth is I'm lacking the real experience of what learning is all about. The minute there are 2 people, 2 is the first number that allows for the possibility of diversity. And if I have the opportunity for diversity, so as we've already seen, it represents the possibility of going deeper than I would have gone on my own. So the significance of the number 2, the shift from the number 1 to the number 2, is like the shift from where there was only Hashem, And then Hashem created the world. And then there became, so to speak, two realities. There's a reality as it is in truth, and a reality as it is perceived by humans, where we think, you know what, Hashem is a nice idea. I'll if I research it for enough years, maybe I will actually accept God as an idea that's real. So that's the value of two. The value of two is that it's the first time that things could work in pairs, in collaboration, that they could partner together, that there's an opportunity for more than just myself. 3 is much more powerful. Why? So 3 is the first odd number. Right? 1 is not really an odd number in the classic sense because 1 is a singular number. It's just itself. Whereas 3 gives you the opportunity for majority. That's why a court has to have 3 members, because if 2 of the judges disagree, the third judge could be the one who sways the case in a particular way. Now you can have majority. As the Torah says, that we are required to follow the majority. So there's a little bit more holiness in the reality of 3. Why? Because 3 is the number of reconciliation. You know, when Rabbi Yishmael taught that there are 13 ways by which you could interpret the Torah, the most famous, of course, is Kal Vachomer. The first one he says, Kal Vachomer, the logical argument that says if something makes sense in this case, it definitely must make sense in a more obvious case. Gezerah Shava, the way that you compare 2 different verses that have the same words, etc. It goes through 13. The last one that he says is, likewise, if you have 2 verses in the Torah that appear to contradict each other and you don't know how to explain them, so you won't have resolution until you find a third verse on the same topic that helps to harmonize the 2. So number 3 is the number of reconciliation. Where there appears to be conflict, it allows you the opportunity to harmonize the apparent conflict into a greater reality. So it's like when you have 2 people fighting and they go to a mediator. So the mediator is the third party. The mediator is not caught up in the emotion of their relevant arguments. So therefore, the mediator can bring them together. If you have the opportunity to reconcile, so where do you have Shechina when you learn Torah? Where do you have more Shechina? Where you learn Torah with a little bit of the opportunity for partnership, which also means the opportunity for conflict. Where do you learn Torah? Where do you get Shechina in an even deeper way? When you get past the conflict and you can reach a stage of actually bringing things together into a sense of reconciliation. That would be an even greater degree of the Shechina. But that reconciliation is nothing compared to if you have 5. Why 5? So for this, we need to look at the pasuk. Va'agudasoi al eretz yisada. It's interesting because the verse is just simply saying that his collection or his bundle or his, so to speak, bringing things together is what established the earth. But what does this pasuk really mean? What exactly did Hashem bring together in order to make the earth? It's very interesting because if you analyze much of life, you will discover that much of life operates in quadrants, in 4s. For example, the cycle of the year is divided into 4 seasons. Or we speak about everything that exists being made of 4 basic elements: fire, air, water, and earth. The life forms on this planet are divided into 4 strata: human, animal, plant, and mineral. The spiritual realm is divided into 4 worlds: Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. The space that we live in is expressed as 4 directions. So the reality, there are many other examples, but the reality of the world that we live in is that it's usually defined by 4 dimensions. Now the prophet Zechariah says something interesting. He says that if we don't behave, if God forbid the people turn their back on Hashem, then Hashem says, I will scatter you like the 4 directions. That's the expression he uses. I will scatter you like the 4 directions. In other words, what's the pasuk telling us? That the number 4 not only is at the underpinning of every element of creation that we are aware of, but it tells us that the nature of our creation is to be disparate, disconnected, pulling in different directions. That's the reality of our world. So the number 5 is the number of Agudah. It's the axis that allows all of the 4 dimensions to pivot. Actually, the best metaphor that we have for this, and I know most people think that it's just a gimmicky game that we play, but it's not. It's much deeper than that. So the classic metaphor that we have for this is the dreidel on Chanukah. So the dreidel has 4 sides, and on those 4 sides you put the 4 letters, Nes Gadol Hayah, either Sham or Poi, depending where you live in the world, that there was a great miracle that happened either here in Israel or there in Israel. And you've got the handle of the dreidel, which is actually the axis, goes from the handle down to the point, and the whole dreidel spins on its axis. That's the agudah, the central beam that brings everything together. How did Hashem create the world? We're taught, Beyud nivra olam haba, behei nivra olam hazeh. That the way Hashem created the world is with the letter Yud, which has the numerical value of 10, Hashem created the next world, the higher world. And with the letter Hey, which has the numerical value of 5, Hashem created our world, our tangible world. Va'agudosoi al eretz yisada. That's what this pasuk is telling us, that the way Hashem established the earth is that all of the disparity, all of the conflict that we see from our 4-dimensional perspective is actually not how the world was intended to be. We have to plug in the central axis that brings everything into its harmonious place. So, for example, if there's fire, air, water, and earth, there's the divine energy that brings those 4 elements together so that you can have whatever it is that you have. Every single thing that exists in the physical world has fire and air and water and earth inside of it, whatever that means. Now, some people want to explain that it's like energy and carbon and oxygen and moisture. Okay, we can debate that outside of this shiur, but the principle is that there's an invisible divine glue that holds all the pieces together. Agudosoi. That's Hashem's, so to speak, binding element of this bundle that is called an agudah. So therefore, if 5 people come together to learn Torah, it's now no longer just about them. 5 people, that means that you represent the nature of how Hashem wants the world to operate. Hashem wants the world to be an environment where all the disparity of the world is brought into focus, into a single direction. That's at the axis that it should all spin on. And where will you find that axis? Obviously within Torah. So now when you're learning Torah together with 5 people, that is much more aligned with what Hashem wants for the world. So there's a higher degree of Shekhinah, divine presence, that is shared at that time, experienced at that time. The ultimate is if you have 10 people. Why 10? 10 is the number that represents completion. And you know, it's such an obvious thing, and yet we don't think about it. The number system goes from 1 to 10. Everything over that is just modifications of the existing numbers. So 11 is just 2 ones. 100 is just 10 multiplied by itself. So the full range of the number system goes from 1 to 10. It's for that reason that the number 10 is always used to represent holiness and spirituality. 10 utterances that Hashem used in order to create the world. 10 spheroids in the supernal realms that become the energy source of the whole of creation. 10 commandments that Hashem uses in order to guide us how we should live as Jewish people. 10 faculties of the soul, that is the operating system that our soul works with. Even when it comes to removing impurity from the world, it's 10 plagues. Because 10 is the number of absolute spiritual perfection. It's the number of holiness. So if I could get 10 people who have neshamas, and each of those neshamas is comprised of 10 faculties, 10 soul powers, and now I have 10 composites of 10 soul powers, I've now got, so to speak, the most perfect number of holiness that could possibly exist. So if you bring those people together, 10 people together to learn, and according to this, obviously, unlike davening, where a minyan is specifically men, when it comes to Torah learning, there's nothing to suggest that this is dafka men. There's no reason why it wouldn't be as much the case for women. 10 people come together, that's 10 groups of 10 soul powers, who are learning the Torah that was given through the 10 commandments. You know, that's 10 statements. We call them dibrois, not tzivuyim. Commandments is a bad translation. They're actually 10 statements that Hashem made. This is the confluence of the highest degree of spirituality and holiness that could exist in the world. So that's how you get the highest degree of Shekhinah that could be present in a person's life. So what's our take home from this Mishnah? Very powerful. Anytime you sit down to learn Torah, there's bracha coming your way. If you have the opportunity to study Torah with another 10 people or more, then you've just activated a degree of connection to Hashem, which is beyond anything that we could ever imagine. So we surely should take advantage of those opportunities when they present themselves.